The crack of a bottle shattering against the saloon wall silenced the room, leaving only the heavy breathing of Owen O'Malley to punctuate the sudden quiet. His weathered knuckles whitened around the edge of the poker table as he stood, 6'3" of barely contained fury towering over the man who just accused him of cheating. "Take it back," Owen growled, the words scraping past his clenched teeth like boots on gravel. His voice carried that distinctive Texas drawl, hardened by 7 years of driving cattle and fighting for respect in a land that gave nothing freely. It was 1874, and Bitter Creek, Wyoming, was the kind of frontier town that existed on the knife's edge between civilization and wilderness. The saloon smelled of whiskey, tobacco, and men who'd spent too long in the saddle without the benefit of a proper bath. "I won't take back the truth," replied Harrison Fletcher, a cattle baron's son who'd never known a day of real work. "Everyone here saw you slip that ace from your sleeve." Owen's blue eyes, sharp as a hawk's beneath the brim of his dust-covered Stetson, narrowed dangerously. "I've buried men for less." The saloon owner, a portly man named Gus who'd survived 2 decades in the territory by knowing when trouble was brewing, moved with surprising speed to place himself between the two men. "Take it outside or take it nowhere, gentlemen," Gus said firmly. "I just replaced those windows last month." Owen's jaw worked silently, the muscles in his face twitching with restraint. Without another word, he scooped up his meager winnings, turned on his heel, and stalked toward the batwing doors. The collective breath of the saloon's patrons released in a whispered whoosh. "That's right," Fletcher called after him. "Walk away like the coward you are." Owen stopped, his broad shoulders tensing beneath his worn cotton shirt. For one heart-stopping moment, everyone expected him to turn and draw. Instead, he pushed through the doors and disappeared into the night. Outside, the cool September air did little to calm his temper. Owen strode down the muddy Main Street, his spurs jingling with each forceful step. He wasn't a cheat, but he wasn't about to beg any man to believe him, especially not some soft-handed Easterner playing at being a frontier tough. At 32, Owen had long ago learned that words were rarely worth the breath it took to speak them. Apologies were particularly useless, empty sounds that changed nothing. He'd apologized to his ma when he'd left home at 16. Sorry hadn't kept her from crying. He'd apologized to his brother when he couldn't save him from the Comanche raid in 65. Sorry hadn't brought him back to life. Owen reached the livery stable where he'd left his horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding named Chance. The animal nickered softly as Owen approached, the only creature on God's green earth that seemed genuinely pleased to see him. "At least you don't expect me to explain myself," Owen muttered, patting the horse's neck. As he prepared to mount up, the stable owner, Old Man Wilkins, appeared in the doorway of the attached living quarters. "Turning in early tonight, O'Malley?" Wilkins asked. "Town's lost its charm," Owen replied curtly. Wilkins chuckled. "Heard there was trouble brewing at Gus's place." "You involved?" "No trouble," Owen said, swinging into the saddle. "Just the usual tall tales." "Speaking of tales," Wilkins said, "heard the Wallace place finally sold. Some widow woman from back east, arriving tomorrow with her kid, according to the stage driver." Owen grunted, uninterested. Another tenderfoot Easterner would likely just mean more trouble for the working cowboys in the area. "Hope she knows what she's getting into," Owen said flatly. "This country eats the unprepared alive." "Might be worth riding by," Wilkins suggested with a knowing smile. "I hear she's a fine-looking woman and not too long widowed," Owen scoffed. "I've got better things to do than play welcome wagon to some city woman with more money than sense." He touched the brim of his hat in a half-hearted salute and rode out of town, the darkness swallowing him whole as he pointed Chance toward the small homestead he'd claimed 3 years prior. He had a herd to move tomorrow and no time for distractions. Dawn broke with a symphony of color across the vast Wyoming sky, pink and gold streaking through the retreating darkness. Owen had been up since well before first light, his routine unchanging regardless of how late he'd stayed in town the previous night. He'd fed his small collection of animals, repaired a section of corral fence that had begun to sag, and prepared to move his modest herd of 30 head to better grazing land. As the sun crested the horizon, Owen rode out with his cattle, his border collie Rusty darting ahead to help guide the animals. His homestead wasn't much 80 acres with a small but sturdy cabin, a corral, and a barn he'd built with his own hands, but it was his, free and clear. In a territory where most men worked for others or lived on credit, Owen took pride in owing no man anything. The morning passed in the familiar rhythm of work. By midday, he'd moved the cattle to a lush stretch of grassland bordered by a clear running creek. Satisfied they would be content for at least a few days, Owen dismounted near the water and allowed Chance to drink while he stretched his legs. It was then that the sound of wheels caught his attention. A wagon was approaching along the rutted track that passed for a road in these parts, moving slowly over the uneven ground. Owen watched with mild curiosity, wondering who would be traveling this way. The Wallace place was the only homestead in this direction, and it had sat empty for nearly 2 years. As the wagon drew closer, Owen could make out a woman at the reins. A large brimmed bonnet protected her face from the sun, but even from a distance, he could see she was struggling with the team of horses, which seemed skittish and uncooperative. "Damn it," Owen muttered to himself, knowing he couldn't in good conscience let her pass without offering assistance. Reluctantly, he mounted Chance and rode toward the wagon. As he approached, one of her horses reared suddenly, nearly toppling the wagon. The woman fought to control the animal, showing surprising strength for her slender frame, but it was a losing battle. "Whoa there." Owen called out, spurring Chance forward. He reached the wagon just as the spooked horse threatened to bolt. With practiced ease, he grabbed the bridle and steadied the animal, speaking low and firm until it settled. "Much obliged," the woman said, her voice carrying a slight Eastern accent but lacking the refined tones Owen had expected. He looked up then and found himself staring into the most striking amber-colored eyes he'd ever seen. They belonged to a woman perhaps in her mid-20s, with auburn hair escaping her bonnet in wind-blown tendrils that framed a heart-shaped face. Her skin was fair but already showing signs of the West's harsh sun, a spray of freckles dusting her straight nose and high cheekbones. "Your horse has a stone bruise," Owen said gruffly, breaking eye contact to examine the animal's hoof. "Needs tending before you go any further." "I suspected as much," she replied, "but I'm afraid my knowledge of horses is somewhat limited." Owen noticed then that the wagon was heavily loaded with furniture, trunks, and various household items, all secured with rope and canvas. In the back, partially hidden by a trunk, sat a child, a boy of perhaps 5 or 6 years, watching him with solemn eyes. "You the new owner of the Wallace place?" Owen asked, though he already knew the answer. "Yes," she said. "I'm Tessa Morgan." She hesitated, then added, "And this is my son, James." The boy nodded but remained silent, his small face serious beneath a mop of dark hair that matched his mother's. Owen touched the brim of his hat. "Owen O'Malley. My property borders yours to the south." He nodded toward the injured horse. "You won't make it to the Wallace place with that animal today. There's a small clearing about a quarter mile ahead. You can make camp there while I tend to your horse." Tessa's chin lifted slightly. "That's very kind, Mr. O'Malley, but we couldn't impose. If you could just show me how to care for the horse." "It's not an imposition, Mrs. Morgan," Owen interrupted. "It's common sense. These parts aren't forgiving to those who don't respect their limitations." A flash of something pride, perhaps, or irritation crossed her features before she nodded. "Very well. We'll accept your help with gratitude." Owen led the way to the clearing, a grassy area sheltered by cottonwood trees near the creek. Once there, he helped Tessa unhitch the team and set up a basic camp, all while saying as few words as possible. The boy, James, watched his every move with cautious interest. As Owen worked on the injured horse, applying a poultice he'd made from creek mud and herbs he carried in his saddlebag, Tessa prepared a simple meal over a small fire. The domesticity of the scene felt strangely foreign to Owen, who had grown accustomed to his solitary existence. "May I ask what brings you to Wyoming territory, Mrs. Morgan?" Owen finally asked, more to break the silence than out of genuine curiosity. Tessa glanced up from the pot she was stirring. "A fresh start, Mr. O'Malley. My husband died last winter, influenza." Her voice was matter-of-fact, but Owen detected a hint of underlying pain. He left us with debts and few prospects in Philadelphia. When I learned the Wallace place was available for a reasonable sum, it seemed providential. Owen frowned. Did whoever sold you that place mention it's 50 miles to the nearest town of any size? That winters here can drop to 30 below, that the soil's rocky and the growing season's short? They mentioned it was challenging, Tessa replied, her tone cooling. But I'm not afraid of hard work, Mr. O'Malley. Hard work might not be enough, Owen said bluntly. I've seen strong men broken by this country. Then it's fortunate I don't intend to break, she responded, a steely determination flashing in her amber eyes. James and I will manage just fine. Owen found himself both irritated and reluctantly impressed by her stubbornness. He finished with the horse and wiped his hands on his bandana. Your horse needs at least 2 days' rest before pulling that wagon again, he said. Tessa's face fell slightly, but she quickly composed herself. I see. Well, we'll make do here until then. You and the boy can't stay out here alone, Owen said, the words escaping before he'd fully considered them. It's not safe. We have little choice, Mr. O'Malley. Owen rubbed the back of his neck, already regretting what he was about to offer. My place is about 3 miles south. You and the boy can stay there while your horse heals. The wagon will be safe enough here. Tessa studied him for a long moment, clearly weighing her limited options. That's very generous, but it's not generosity, Owen cut in, uncomfortable with her gratitude. It's practicality. I've got space and you've got need. Simple as that. After a moment's consideration, Tessa nodded. Thank you, Mr. O'Malley, we accept. They ate a simple meal of beans and hardtack, with jerky for the boy, who remained quiet throughout. Afterward, Owen helped Tessa secure the wagon and retrieve the necessities they would need for a couple of days. The boy would ride with his mother on the spare horse, while Owen led the way on chance. As they prepared to depart, Tessa turned to survey the wagon one last time. The sight of her slender but straight-backed, chin lifted with determination as she gazed at the worldly possessions she'd brought across the country stirred something unexpected in Owen's chest. She wasn't what he'd expected. There was a quiet strength about her that seemed at odds with her refined appearance. Everything you own in that wagon? He asked. Everything that would fit, she replied. Everything that mattered. Owen nodded, understanding the weight of her words. He knew about leaving things behind, about choosing what mattered enough to carry forward into an uncertain future. They rode in silence, the vastness of the Wyoming landscape stretching around them. The boy, James, sat in front of his mother, his small hands gripping the saddle horn with white-knuckled intensity. You ever been on a horse before, boy? Owen asked. The first direct words he'd spoken to the child. James glanced at him, then shook his head. He hasn't had much opportunity in the city, Tessa explained. But he'll learn quickly, won't you, James? The boy nodded solemnly. Yes, Mama, learning quick is good, Owen said. Out here, slow learners often don't get second chances. Tessa's arms tightened protectively around her son. We're aware of the challenges, Mr. O'Malley. Owen didn't respond. He doubted very much that she truly understood what she was facing, but he'd said his piece. What happened from here was her decision, her responsibility. He was just providing temporary shelter, nothing more. They crested a low rise, and Owen's homestead came into view. It wasn't much to look at: a simple log cabin with a stone chimney, a corral, a small barn, and a vegetable garden that had seen better days. But it was solid, built to withstand the harsh Wyoming winters and the occasional summer storm that rolled through with destructive force. It's not fancy, Owen said, feeling strangely self-conscious as Tessa surveyed his home. It looks sturdy, she replied. That matters more than fancy out here, I imagine. Owen nodded, surprised by her practical assessment. Perhaps there was more to Tessa Morgan than he'd initially thought. As they dismounted, James clung to his mother's skirts, eyeing Owen warily. The boy's caution was reasonable. Owen knew he made an imposing figure with his tall frame, weathered face, and perpetual scowl. He'd never been good with children, having had little exposure to them since his own abbreviated childhood. You can take the cabin, Owen said, leading the horses toward the corral. I'll sleep in the barn while you're here. We couldn't possibly displace you from your home, Tessa protested. The barn would be more than adequate for us. The barn's no place for a woman and child, Owen said firmly. I sleep out there half the time anyway when I'm tending to sick animals or during calving season. It wasn't entirely true, but Owen felt an unusual compulsion to offer some comfort to this woman and her quiet son. Something about their dignified determination in the face of what was clearly desperate circumstances stirred long-dormant emotions in him. Thank you, Tessa said simply, accepting his offer with grace. Owen showed them into the cabin, suddenly aware of its sparse furnishings and utilitarian nature. A stone fireplace dominated one wall with a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs nearby. A narrow bed sat in one corner, a trunk at its foot. A few shelves held books, ammunition, and various tools. It was a bachelor's home with nothing soft or welcoming about it. It's not much, he said gruffly. It's shelter, Tessa replied, and that's what we need right now. Owen nodded, appreciating her lack of complaint. There's food in the larder, help yourself to whatever you need. Pumps out back for water. Outhouse is beyond that. I'll be in the barn if you need anything. With that, he turned to leave, eager to escape the unfamiliar feeling of having others in his personal space. As he reached the door, James's small voice stopped him. Thank you, mister. Owen glanced back, surprised. The boy still clung to his mother, but his eyes met Owen's directly. You're welcome, Owen replied, the words feeling strange on his tongue. He couldn't remember the last time he'd said them to anyone. Outside, Owen busied himself with chores, grateful for the physical activity that allowed him to avoid thinking too deeply about the woman and child currently occupying his cabin. He fed and watered his livestock, mended a broken harness, and split additional firewood, working until sweat soaked his shirt despite the cool September air. As dusk approached, Tessa appeared at the barn door, James still shadowing her closely. I've prepared supper, she said. It seems only fair that you eat with us, considering we're imposing on your hospitality. No need, Owen replied, hammering a nail into the repaired harness with perhaps more force than necessary. Perhaps not, Tessa agreed, but it would be appreciated nonetheless. James and I aren't accustomed to dining alone. Something in her tone made Owen look up. There was a vulnerability there, hidden beneath her composed exterior, that resonated with him. He recognized the look of someone trying desperately to maintain normalcy in abnormal circumstances. I'll wash up, he conceded. Supper was a simple affair of beans, bacon, and cornbread, but Tessa had somehow transformed Owen's basic staples into something that tasted better than his own cooking ever managed. They ate mostly in silence, broken occasionally by Tessa's gentle prompting of James to eat more or sit up straighter. How long have you been in Wyoming, Mr. O'Malley? Tessa eventually asked. 7 years, Owen replied. Came west after the war. Which side? The question slipped out before Tessa could stop herself, and she immediately looked contrite. Forgive me, that was impertinent. Union, Owen said simply. Though out here it matters less than back east. A man's judged more by what he does than where he fought. Tessa nodded. That's refreshing. Your husband, Owen began, then hesitated. He serve? Yes, Tessa said. Union as well. It's where we met, actually. I was a nurse at a field hospital in Virginia. Owen's eyebrows rose slightly. That explained her practical nature and lack of squeamishness. Field hospitals during the war had been brutal places. That's where I learned that life doesn't always follow the path we expect, Tessa continued, her eyes distant with memory. Thomas, my husband, he survived the war only to be taken by illness 9 years later. It seems a cruel irony. Life's full of those, Owen agreed. James had finished eating and now sat quietly, his eyelids growing heavy. Tessa noticed and smiled gently at her son. Time for bed, I think, she said. Say good night to Mr. O'Malley, James. Good night, Mr. O'Malley, the boy repeated dutifully. Night, boy, Owen replied awkwardly. After settling James in the bed, Tessa returned to the table where Owen still sat, nursing a cup of coffee. He's a good lad, Owen observed. Quiet. Too quiet sometimes, Tessa admitted. He took his father's death hard. Thomas was a loving father. She sighed. James barely speaks now except to me, and even then not much. Your place is the first time I've heard him speak to a stranger in months. Owen wasn't sure how to respond to this confidence. He'd never been good at offering comfort or advice. He'll find his voice again, he finally said. Some hurts take time to heal. Do they? Tessa asked softly. Heal, I mean, the question seemed to hang in the air between them, weighted with meaning beyond the simple words. Owen felt a strange connection to this woman who, like him, carried invisible scars. Some do, he allowed. Others you just learn to live with. Tessa studied him, those unusual amber eyes seeming to see more than Owen was comfortable revealing. You speak from experience, she observed. Owen stood abruptly, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. It's late, I should let you rest. Morning comes early out here. Tessa didn't press, merely nodding her acceptance of his retreat. Of course. Thank you again for your kindness, Mr. O'Malley. Owen, he said, the word surprising them both. You might as well call me Owen. A small smile curved her lips. Then I insist you call me Tessa. Owen nodded stiffly and made his escape to the barn, where he made a bedroll in the hayloft. Sleep eluded him for hours as he stared at the rough-hewn beams above, his mind inexplicably filled with amber eyes and the quiet dignity of a woman facing an uncertain future with nothing but determination and a silent child. The next morning dawned clear and cool, with the promise of warmth as the sun climbed higher. Owen had risen before first light, completing his usual morning chores before returning to the cabin. He hesitated outside the door, unaccustomed to considering whether he might be intruding in his own home. A soft laugh from inside the first he'd heard from either of his guests made him pause. Through the window, he caught a glimpse of Tessa helping James wash his face, the boy squirming and giggling as she playfully threatened him with the wet cloth. The scene was so domestic, so normal, and yet so foreign to Owen's solitary existence that he felt a strange tightness in his chest. He knocked on his own door, feeling foolish but unwilling to intrude on their private moment. Come in, Tessa called. Owen entered to find breakfast already prepared, coffee bubbling in the pot, bacon frying in the skillet, and what appeared to be biscuits baking in the Dutch oven. You didn't have to do all this, he said, removing his hat. It seemed the least we could do, Tessa replied. Besides, James and I are early risers as well. The boy sat at the table, his hair damp from washing, watching Owen with those solemn eyes that seemed too old for his young face. I need to ride back and check on your horse today, Owen said, accepting the cup of coffee Tessa offered. See how that hoof's healing. I'd like to come along, Tessa said. I should learn how to treat such injuries myself if we're to manage on our own. Owen nodded, seeing the practicality in her request. The boy can stay here, it'll be safer. No, James said suddenly, his small voice firm. I want to go too. Owen and Tessa both looked at the child in surprise. It was the most assertive either had heard him. James, Tessa began, it's a long ride and I can ride with you, James insisted, a hint of his mother's determination showing in his set jaw. I won't complain. Owen found himself impressed by the boy's resolve. He can ride with me, he offered, surprising himself as much as Tessa. Chance is steady enough. Tessa hesitated, clearly torn between protecting her son and allowing him this small independence. Are you certain? He's never really ridden before yesterday. He'll be fine, Owen assured her. Boy needs to learn sooner or later. After breakfast, they set out for the clearing where they'd left Tessa's wagon. James sat in front of Owen, his small back rigid with concentration as he tried to match Owen's easy rhythm with the horse's gait. Relax, Owen instructed. Horse can feel when you're tense. Just let your body move with him. Gradually, James began to loosen up, his body settling into the motion of the horse beneath him. By the time they reached the wagon, he was smiling faintly, clearly pleased with himself. The injured horse was grazing contentedly, showing signs of improvement. Owen demonstrated to Tessa how to check the hoof and apply a fresh poultice, explaining each step carefully. You've a gentle touch with animals, Tessa observed as Owen worked. They don't ask for explanations, Owen replied. Just honest treatment. Unlike people, Tessa ventured. Owen glanced up, caught by her perceptive question. People want words, apologies, promises, things that don't change what's happened or what will happen. Sometimes words matter, Tessa said softly. not to change the past but to acknowledge it, to show understanding. Maybe for some, Owen conceded, returning his attention to the horse. Never worked that way for me. They spent the remainder of the day at the clearing, Tessa checking the wagon's contents to ensure nothing had been disturbed overnight, while Owen repaired a broken wheel spoke he'd noticed the day before. James explored the area under his mother's watchful eye, collecting interesting rocks and asking Owen the names of various plants and insects he encountered. As they prepared to return to Owen's homestead for the night, a distant rumble of thunder warned of an approaching storm. Owen glanced at the darkening western sky with a frown. "We should head back," he said. "Storms come fast in these parts." They mounted up quickly, James again riding with Owen while Tessa took the spare horse. They had covered perhaps half the distance to Owen's property when the storm hit with unexpected ferocity. Rain lashed at them in horizontal sheets, driven by a howling wind that seemed determined to sweep them from their saddles. "This way." Owen shouted over the storm's roar, veering off the trail toward a stand of trees that offered some shelter. Beneath the largest tree was a small lean-to he'd built years ago as a weather shelter when working this section of his property. They dismounted hurriedly, Tessa lifting James down while Owen secured the horses under the partial cover of the trees. The lean-to was small, just big enough for the three of them if they sat close together. Owen built a small fire just inside the entrance, using the dry kindling he kept stored there for emergencies. James huddled against his mother, shivering in his wet clothes. Tessa wasn't much better, her dress soaked through and her hair plastered to her pale face. "You're both going to catch your death," Owen muttered, rummaging in his saddlebags. He produced a relatively dry blanket and handed it to Tessa. "Get the boy out of those wet things and wrap him in this." Tessa didn't argue, helping James remove his soaked outer clothing while Owen tactfully focused on building up the fire. Once James was bundled in the blanket, Owen shrugged out of his duster and passed it to Tessa. "You need to get dry too," he said gruffly. "What about you?" She asked, even as she gratefully accepted the coat. "I've weathered worse," Owen replied, though in truth the cold was already seeping into his bones. Wyoming storms could turn deadly quick, especially as autumn approached. They sat in silence for a time, listening to the storm rage outside their fragile shelter. James eventually dozed off, exhausted by the day's events and lulled by the warmth of the fire and his mother's embrace. "Will it last long?" Tessa asked quietly, mindful of her sleeping son. "Hard to say," Owen replied. "These storms sometimes blow through quick, others stick around for days." "Days." Tessa's eyes widened with concern. "This one doesn't feel like a long one," Owen assured her, though he had no real way of knowing. "But we're better off waiting it out here than trying to make it back in this." Tessa nodded, accepting his judgment. "You know this land well." "Had to learn," Owen said. "It's not forgiving of mistakes." "Is that why you live alone?" Tessa asked, then immediately backtracked. "Forgive me." That was presumptuous. Owen was silent for so long that Tessa thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost lost beneath the patter of rain on the lean-to's roof. "I live alone because it's simpler. No one to disappoint, no one to fail." The rawness of his admission hung in the air between them. Tessa studied him in the flickering firelight, seeing past the hard exterior to the pain that lurked beneath. "We all fail sometimes," she said gently. "It's part of being human." "Some failures cost more than others," Owen replied. Tessa shifted slightly, adjusting James in her arms. "After Thomas died, I felt I'd failed him somehow, that if I'd been a better nurse, a better wife, I might have saved him. It was foolish, of course. Influenza takes whom it will, but guilt isn't rational." Owen looked at her then, really looked at her, seeing the strength it took to voice such vulnerability. "No," he agreed, "it's not." "What happened?" Tessa asked softly. "What failure haunts you so? Perhaps it was the storm, isolating them from the rest of the world. Perhaps it was the late hour or the unusual intimacy of their shared shelter. Whatever the reason, Owen found himself speaking of things he'd never voiced aloud. "My brother," he said, the words coming slow and painful. "After the war, we came west together. Daniel was the smart one, the one with plans. I was just muscle, good with animals and a gun." Owen stared into the fire, lost in memory. We worked a cattle drive up from Texas, good money, enough to start our own place. He fell silent, the words sticking in his throat. What happened to him? Tessa prompted gently. Comanche raid. 1867, we fought them off, but Danny took an arrow, got infected. Owen's jaw clenched. I should have known better, should have gotten him to a doctor sooner, but I thought I could handle it myself, save the money we'd earned. His voice dropped to a whisper. He died calling my name, asking me to help him. The confession hung in the air, raw and painful. Tessa didn't rush to offer empty platitudes for which Owen was grateful. Instead, she simply sat with his grief, acknowledging it with her silence. I'm sorry, she finally said. Not for your choice, but for your loss. Been a long time, Owen said roughly. Shouldn't still matter. Of course it matters, Tessa replied. Love doesn't stop mattering just because time passes. Owen looked away, uncomfortable with her insight. We should try to get some sleep. Morning might bring better weather. Tessa accepted his withdrawal, understanding he'd already shared more than he was accustomed to. You're right. Thank you for the shelter and the fire. It's nothing, Owen muttered. It's not nothing, Tessa insisted quietly. It's kindness. And kindness is never nothing, Owen. Her use of his first name and the gentle way she spoke it created a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the fire. Owen leaned back against the wall of the lean-to, hat pulled low over his eyes, and pretended to sleep while his mind churned with unfamiliar emotions. The storm passed during the night, leaving behind a washed, clean world gleaming in the early morning sunlight. They returned to Owen's homestead to find everything intact, though the chicken coop had lost a few shingles to the wind. The next 2 days fell into an unexpectedly comfortable routine. Tessa took over the cooking and mending, while Owen tended to the livestock and property. James seemed to blossom in the open spaces, his silence gradually giving way to cautious questions about the animals and the land. Owen found himself responding with more patience than he knew he possessed, showing the boy how to collect eggs without frightening the hens and how to approach the more docile cattle safely. On the morning of the 3rd day, Owen rode to check on Tessa's horse again and returned with good news. The hoofs healed clean, he reported. Should be sound enough to pull the wagon now. Tessa's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. That's wonderful. We can finally stop imposing on your hospitality. It's been no imposition, Owen said, surprising himself with the sincerity of the words. Nevertheless, we've delayed your normal routine long enough, Tessa replied. I'm sure you'll be glad to have your home to yourself again. Owen wasn't at all sure of that, but he merely nodded. I'll help you get settled at the Wallace place. It'll need some work before winter sets in. They rode out after midday, Tessa and James in the wagon with their belongings, Owen leading the way on chance. The journey to the Wallace homestead took several hours, the wagon moving slowly over the rutted trail. The property, when they finally reached it, was in worse condition than Owen had expected. The cabin was sound enough, but the roof needed repairs, and the small barn was missing several boards from its walls. The well appeared intact, but the windmill that drew the water needed new blades. Owen saw the momentary flash of dismay on Tessa's face before she squared her shoulders and lifted her chin with that now familiar determination. It's not as bad as it looks, she said, more to herself than to him or James. With some work, it will be quite comfortable. Owen dismounted, mentally cataloging the repairs needed before winter arrived. The cabin needs to be your priority, he said. Winters here are brutal. You need solid shelter first, then worry about the outbuildings. Tessa nodded, accepting his advice. Will you show me what needs to be done most urgently? They spent the remainder of the day assessing the property. Owen showed Tessa how to test the cabin's chinking for weak spots, how to identify rotting wood in the roof, and how to determine which repairs she could manage herself and which might require assistance. As dusk approached, Owen helped her unload enough from the wagon to make the cabin habitable for the night. James, excited by the adventure of their new home, explored every corner of the small building, claiming a tiny room off the main living area as his own. It's a good, solid place, Owen said as he prepared to leave. Built to last if you maintain it. Thank you, Tessa said, standing in the doorway of her new home. For everything, we would have been in dire straits without your help. Owen shifted uncomfortably, unused to gratitude. Any neighbor would have done the same. Perhaps, Tessa allowed, but it was you who did it. Owen mounted Chance, suddenly eager to escape the unfamiliar emotions swirling within him. I'll check back in a few days, see how you're managing. Tessa smiled, that same not quite reaching her eyes smile from earlier. That's not necessary, we'll be fine. Nonetheless, Owen said firmly, winter's coming, you'll need help getting prepared. Before she could protest further, he touched the brim of his hat in farewell and rode away, feeling her eyes on his back long after he'd passed out of sight. The next week passed slowly for Owen. He threw himself into his work, repairing fences, checking his herd, and preparing his own property for the coming winter. But despite his best efforts to focus solely on the tasks at hand, his thoughts continually drifted to Tessa and James. Were they managing in that dilapidated cabin? Had Tessa been able to make the most urgent repairs? Was James adjusting to their new life? The questions plagued him, disrupting his sleep and making him irritable with his livestock. Finally, unable to bear the uncertainty any longer, Owen loaded his wagon with supplies, extra firewood, some preserved meat from his smokehouse, tools she might not have, and a small bag of hard candies he'd been saving for no particular occasion, and headed for the Wallace place. He arrived to find Tessa on the roof of the cabin, hammer in hand, replacing broken shingles with grim determination. James sat below, handing up supplies as needed. The boy spotted Owen first, his face lighting up with genuine pleasure. "Mr. O'Malley," James called, waving enthusiastically. "Look, Mama's fixing the roof." Tessa turned at her son's call, nearly losing her balance in surprise. Owen's heart leaped to his throat before she steadied herself with a graceful movement that belied the precariousness of her position. "Owen," she said, her voice carrying a note of pleased surprise. "I didn't expect to see you. Said I'd check on you," Owen replied, dismounting. He eyed her position on the roof critically. "That's dangerous work." "It needs doing," Tessa said simply, hammering another shingle into place. "I brought some supplies," Owen said, gesturing to his wagon. "Thought you might need them." Tessa's expression softened. "That's very kind, we're managing, but extras are always welcome." She made her way carefully to the edge of the roof and began to climb down the ladder James had propped against the eaves. Halfway down, her foot slipped on a damp rung, and she fell with a startled cry. Owen moved without thinking, covering the distance between them in 3 long strides and catching her before she hit the ground. The impact drove the breath from his lungs, but he maintained his footing, his arms full of a very surprised Tessa Morgan. For a moment they stared at each other, faces inches apart, both too stunned to speak. Owen was acutely aware of her weight in his arms, the soft curve of her waist beneath his hand, the faint scent of lavender that somehow persisted despite days of hard labor. "Mama." James's worried voice broke the spell. "Are you hurt?" Tessa blinked, color rushing to her cheeks as Owen carefully set her on her feet. "I'm fine, James, just clumsy." She straightened her skirts, not quite meeting Owen's eyes. "Thank you, that could have been a nasty fall." Owen cleared his throat, suddenly finding it difficult to form words. "You shouldn't be up there alone. Roofing's not one-person work." "I don't have much choice," Tessa replied, a hint of defensiveness in her tone. "It needed doing, and I'm the only adult here." "You have neighbors," Owen said. "Me, specifically?" "I can't keep relying on your charity, Owen." "It's not charity," Owen insisted, frustrated by her stubborn independence. "It's neighborliness. Out here, people help each other. Have to survive." Tessa studied him, those amber eyes seeming to see right through his gruff exterior. "Very well," she finally conceded. "I would appreciate your help with the roof, and perhaps the windmill if you have time." The admission clearly cost her something in pride, but Owen appreciated her pragmatism. "Good," he said with a nod. "I'll finish the roof today. Windmill might take longer." And so began a new pattern. Owen rode to the Wallace place every few days, helping with repairs that required more strength or expertise than Tessa possessed. In return, she provided meals and companionship that Owen found himself increasingly looking forward to. James blossomed under Owen's quiet guidance, eagerly absorbing everything the older man taught him about animals, the land, and the practical skills needed for frontier life. The boy's solemn silence gave way to curious questions and occasional laughter, particularly when Owen taught him to fish in the creek that ran near the property. Weeks passed, and autumn deepened around them. The trees turned gold and crimson, then gradually shed their leaves as the first frost silvered the grass in the mornings. The cabin was now weathertight, the barn secure enough to house Tessa's small collection of livestock, the 2 horses, a milk cow Owen had helped her purchase, and a half-dozen chickens. One evening, as they sat around the hearth after a satisfying day's work, James already asleep in his small room, Owen found himself studying Tessa's profile in the firelight. She had changed in the weeks since her arrival. Her skin had tanned from outdoor work, her hands had grown calloused, and her auburn hair, when not confined beneath a bonnet, showed golden highlights from the sun. Yet the greatest change was in her confidence. She moved with the assurance of a woman who knew her own capabilities and limitations. "Penny for your thoughts," Tessa said softly, catching his gaze. Owen looked away, embarrassed to be caught staring. "Just thinking you've taken to this life better than most." Tessa smiled, the expression genuine and warm. "It's not what I expected, certainly, but there's a freedom here I never had in Philadelphia. Despite the hardships, I find I prefer it. And James seems to be thriving," Owen observed. "Yes," Tessa agreed, her expression softening as she glanced toward her son's room. "I worried so much about bringing him to such an isolated place, but he's happier here than he's been since Thomas died." She hesitated, then added, "Much of that is thanks to you." Owen shifted uncomfortably, unused to praise. "Boy just needed space to breathe, is all." "It's more than that," Tessa insisted. "You've been patient with him, taught him useful skills, given him a male presence in his life that he desperately needed." She looked down at her hands, twisting in her lap. "I can never repay you for that kindness." "Don't need repayment," Owen said gruffly. "Been a pleasure watching him come out of his shell." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the promise of snow on its breath. "First real snow will come tonight," Owen predicted, rising from his chair. "I should head back before it starts." Tessa stood as well, disappointment flashing briefly across her face before she composed herself. "Of course. Thank you for your help with the livestock shelter today." Owen donned his coat and hat, oddly reluctant to leave the warmth of Tessa's cabin and company. At the door he paused, words he hadn't planned to speak forming on his tongue. "The snow might be heavy," he said. "I'll ride by tomorrow, make sure you're not snowed in." Tessa's smile brightened her entire face. "We'd welcome the company," she said softly. Owen nodded, suddenly unable to trust his voice. He stepped out into the chill night air, the stars sharp and clear overhead. As he mounted Chance for the ride home, he glanced back to see Tessa still standing in the doorway, a slender silhouette framed by golden lamplight. Something shifted in his chest then, a realization that had been building for weeks finally crystallizing into clarity. The solitude he'd so carefully cultivated for years no longer felt like freedom, it felt like emptiness. And the prospect of returning to his empty cabin held none of the appeal it once had. The snow came as Owen had predicted, several inches falling overnight to blanket the landscape in pristine white. He set out for the Wallace place shortly after dawn, breaking trail through the fresh powder. As he approached the cabin, he saw smoke rising from the chimney and James outside, bundled against the cold, attempting to build a snowman. The boy spotted him and waved enthusiastically, his breath pluming in the frigid air. "Mr. O'Malley, look at all the snow." Owen dismounted, smiling despite himself at the child's excitement. "Good sledding weather," he observed. "Might have to see about making you a proper sled." James's eyes widened with delight. "Could we really? Reckon so," Owen replied, leading Chance toward the small barn. "Where's your mother?" "Inside, making breakfast," James said, patting more snow onto his lopsided creation. "She said you'd come check on us." Owen's chest warmed at the thought that Tessa had expected him, had perhaps even looked forward to his arrival. He secured Chance in the barn and walked with James to the cabin, pausing to help the boy brush snow from his coat before entering. The cabin was warm and fragrant with the smell of coffee and frying bacon. Tessa stood at the stove, her hair braided down her back, humming softly as she worked. She turned at their entrance, her smile so welcoming that Owen felt something catch in his throat. "Right on time," she said. "I was just about to call James in for breakfast." "Smells good," Owen said, removing his hat and coat. They ate together, the conversation flowing easily between them. James chattered excitedly about the snow and the possibility of a sled, while Tessa and Owen exchanged amused glances over his head. After breakfast, Owen helped Tessa with the morning chores, then spent time showing James how to identify animal tracks in the fresh snow. The boy proved an apt pupil, quickly learning to distinguish between rabbit, deer, and fox prints. As the short winter day began to wane, Owen realized he'd spent the entire day at the Wallace place without once thinking about the work waiting at his own homestead. More surprisingly, he felt no guilt about it, only a sense of contentment he couldn't remember experiencing before. "You're welcome to stay for supper," Tessa offered as they walked back toward the cabin, James running ahead to tell his mother about the tracks they'd found. "I should probably head back," Owen said, though without conviction. Tessa stopped, turning to face him fully. "Owen," she began, then hesitated, seeming to search for the right words. "You know you're always welcome here, not just to help with repairs or check on us after storms, just to be here with us." The sincerity in her voice, the open invitation in her eyes struck Owen to his core. For years, he'd convinced himself that solitude was his natural state, that connections only led to pain and disappointment. Yet here was this woman, offering him a place in her life, in her home, with no expectation beyond his presence. "I'd like that," he admitted, the words feeling like both a surrender and a victory. Tessa's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. "Good," she said simply. That evening, as they sat by the fire after James had gone to bed, Owen found himself speaking of things he rarely discussed: his childhood in Texas, his time in the Union Army, the bond he'd shared with his brother. Tessa listened with genuine interest, offering her own stories in return: her life in Philadelphia, her work as a nurse during the war, her marriage to Thomas. "He was a good man," she said softly, "a good father and husband, but it was different from what we have now." She looked up suddenly, meeting Owen's gaze. "What James and I have now, I mean." "I understood," Owen said, though a part of him hoped she might have meant something else entirely. Tessa set aside her mending and moved to poke at the fire, her profile gilded by the flames. "Winter's just beginning," she observed. "The snow, the isolation, I worried it would be difficult for us." "And is it?" Owen asked. "Less so than I feared," Tessa admitted, "though I'm grateful for your frequent visits. They break the monotony." "Happy to provide entertainment," Owen said dryly. Tessa laughed, the sound warming him more than the fire ever could. "It's not just entertainment, it's companionship." She hesitated, then added softly, "I've missed that." Owen found himself on unfamiliar ground, words he'd never thought to speak hovering on the tip of his tongue. Before he could find the courage to voice them, however, a gust of wind howled down the chimney, sending sparks dancing across the hearth. "Storm's picking up," Owen observed, grateful for the distraction. "Might be in for a blizzard." Tessa frowned, moving to the window to peer out into the darkness. "Will you be able to make it back safely?" Owen joined her at the window, their shoulders nearly touching as they gazed out at the swirling snow. Visibility had dropped significantly, and the wind was driving the snow into drifts that would make travel treacherous. "Probably not wise to try," he admitted reluctantly. "Then you'll stay," Tessa said firmly. "You can take my bed, I'll sleep with James." "I'll be fine by the fire," Owen insisted. "Not the first time I've slept on a floor." Tessa looked as though she might argue, but instead she nodded. "I'll fetch some blankets." The storm raged through the night, wind rattling the windows and driving snow against the walls of the cabin. Owen lay awake long after Tessa had retired, listening to the howling wind and contemplating the strange turn his life had taken since the day he'd encountered a determined widow and her silent son on the trail to the Wallace place. Morning brought a transformed world. The snow had stopped, but drifts reached nearly to the windowsills in places. Owen stepped outside to assess the situation and found himself wading through snow up to his thighs. "No traveling today," he announced when he returned to the cabin where Tessa was preparing breakfast and James was watching the winter wonderland outside with fascination. "Will your animals be all right?" Tessa asked, concerned. "They've got shelter and food," Owen replied. "They'll manage a day or two." And so began 3 days of unexpected cohabitation. The storm had effectively isolated them from the rest of the world, creating a small, intimate universe consisting solely of the cabin and its immediate surroundings. They fell into a comfortable routine, sharing chores, playing simple games with James in the evenings, telling stories by the fire. Owen taught James to whittle, carefully guiding the boy's small hands as they transformed a piece of pine into a crude but recognizable horse. Tessa mended Owen's worn shirts without being asked, her nimble fingers repairing tears and replacing missing buttons with quiet efficiency. It was a glimpse of what family life could be. Owen realized not the lonely existence he'd resigned himself to, but something warm and sustaining. The knowledge both comforted and terrified him. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, the temperature rose enough to begin melting the snow. By evening, Owen knew he would be able to make the journey back to his homestead the following morning. "The pass should be clear enough by tomorrow," he said as they sat by the fire that night, James already asleep. "Yes," Tessa agreed, her tone carefully neutral. "I'm sure you're anxious to check on your property." "Need to see to the livestock," Owen said, though in truth, he felt no urgency to return to his solitary cabin. A silence fell between them, heavier than any they'd shared before. Owen stared into the fire, searching for words to express the tumult of emotions within him. "Tessa," he finally began, "these past months have been a blessing," she finished when he faltered. "For James and me, for me as well," Owen admitted. "More than I can say." Tessa set aside her sewing and looked at him directly, her amber eyes reflecting the firelight. "Owen, may I speak plainly?" he nodded, his throat suddenly dry. "When Thomas died, I thought that part of my life was over," she said quietly. "The part where I was not just a mother but a woman with her own needs and desires. I came west seeking independence, not connection." She took a deep breath. "But then I met you, a man who seemed determined to need no one, yet who showed such kindness to a stranger and her child." Owen sat perfectly still, afraid that any movement might break the spell of her words. "I find myself thinking of you when you're not here," Tessa continued, her cheeks flushing slightly. "Looking forward to your visits with an eagerness that goes beyond mere neighborly friendship." "Tessa," Owen said, his voice rough with emotion, "I'm not good with words, never have been. But these months with you and James, they've changed something in me." He looked down at his calloused hands, searching for the right words. "For years, I've kept to myself, figured it was safer that way, couldn't disappoint anyone if I didn't let anyone close." He looked up then, meeting her gaze directly. "But watching you these past months, your courage, your determination to build a life here, it's made me want things I'd given up on, made me want to be part of something again, part of a family." The last word came out barely above a whisper, but in the quiet cabin, it seemed to echo like thunder. Tessa's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Is that what you want, Owen? A family?" "Your family," he clarified. "You and James, if you'll have me." Tessa rose from her chair and moved to kneel beside him, taking his rough hands in her smaller ones. "James already adores you," she said softly. "And she paused, her eyes searching his. "I believe I could love you, Owen O'Malley. In fact, I think I already do." Owen had never been a man of grand gestures or eloquent speeches. But in that moment, with Tessa's hands in his and her heart open before him, he found the courage to do what he'd never done before, to reach for happiness, instead of merely enduring its absence. He leaned forward and kissed her, a gentle touch that deepened as Tessa responded with equal fervor. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Owen rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said simply, the words he'd thought he'd never speak to anyone again. "And I love that boy in there like he was my own already." Tessa's smile was radiant through her tears. "Then I think, Mr. O'Malley, that we have ourselves an understanding. Spring came to Wyoming with a rush of green and a riot of wildflowers across the newly thawed prairie. The Wallace place, now the O'Malley place, following a simple ceremony performed by a traveling preacher in March, had undergone a transformation nearly as dramatic as the landscape. The cabin boasted a new addition, built by Owen with help from neighboring ranchers who'd welcomed Tessa and James into the small community. The barn stood solid and weathertight, housing an expanded collection of livestock including a pair of fine horses Owen had purchased for the family. A vegetable garden, tended carefully by Tessa, promised a bountiful harvest for the coming year. On a warm May afternoon, Owen sat on the porch he'd built, watching as James, now more confident and outspoken than the silent child who'd arrived the previous autumn, attempted to teach their new puppy to fetch a stick. Tessa emerged from the cabin, wiping her hands on her apron, her figure showing the first gentle swell of the child they expected in late autumn. She settled beside Owen on the bench, her shoulder against his, comfortable in the casual intimacy they now shared. Happy? Owen asked, though he knew the answer from the contentment in her eyes. Completely, Tessa replied, reaching for his hand. Though I was thinking about the day we met, how different things might have been if you hadn't stopped to help. Owen squeezed her fingers gently. Been thinking on that myself, how close I came to riding past, too stubborn to get involved. What changed your mind? Tessa asked curiously. Owen was quiet for a moment, remembering that day the sight of her struggling with the wagon, the determination in her stance even as she faced what must have seemed an insurmountable challenge. Saw something in you, he finally said. Something that made me want to be better than I was. Made me want to try again, I guess. Tessa leaned her head against his shoulder, watching as James finally succeeded in getting the puppy to retrieve the stick, his delighted laughter carrying across the yard. I'm glad you did, she said softly. Try again, I mean. Owen slipped his arm around her waist, drawing her closer. Best decision I ever made, he murmured. Only wish I'd learned sooner that sometimes words are worth speaking, apologies worth making. Perhaps everything happens when it's meant to, Tessa suggested. When we're ready to learn the lessons we need. Owen considered this, watching his adopted son play in the yard of the home they'd built together. Maybe so, he agreed, maybe so. As the afternoon sun bathed the homestead in golden light, Owen O'Malley, once a solitary man who believed connection brought only pain, held his family close, and silently thanked whatever twist of fate had placed him on that trail the day a determined widow needed help with her wagon. In finding the courage to reach out that day, he'd found not just a woman to love but a life worth living, and the words to express what truly mattered.